Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we examine the intersection of sexual liberation, freedom of choice, and the digital age. In the second half of our show, entrepreneur and adult video pioneer Peter Ackworth describes his burgeoning San Francisco fetish production business, Kink.com, and its run-ins with regulators and cultural scolds. Up first, Phil Harvey, founder and former president of DKT International, and the president of Adam and Eve, joins us to recall his many decades on the front lines of the international family planning movement. Phil, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Phil, while still in graduate school back in the early 1970s, you opened the first mail-order contraceptives business in America. This launched you on two journeys. One as a major international philanthropist, and the other is perhaps the most influential figure in the American sex industry. Take us back to earlier days, even before that, when you were working for CARE in India, so we can understand how it all began.
Well, the India days, which were the early 1960s, were formative in some ways for both of those initiatives.
Mm-hmm.
I was with CARE. We were importing an enormous amount of American food, which was a foolish policy as I look back on it. But we were feeding a lot of school children, which seemed certainly worthwhile and valuable at the time. But I began to realize as this food kept pouring in and the number of children kept going up and up and up, and our ability to feed them all was strained, that providing birth control, family planning, a way of not necessarily limiting, but at least spacing and controlling births would be a much more effective way of providing assistance to India than sending a lot of imported food around that competed with locally grown food in ways that turned out not to be too good.
And the idea of that kind of family planning was controversial at the time, was it not?
It was probably less controversial in India than almost anywhere else in the world. India recognized that it had a population growth problem. In fact, I think they probably exaggerated the extent of that problem as we look back. And, of course, China next door, with the other largest world population, had introduced a number of draconian steps to control the number of births. So India was pretty aggressive about promoting family planning, and they invested a lot in trying to convince people through marketing methods to have a limited number of children. That part of it didn't do very well. So the atmosphere for family planning work in India was quite good, and a group of people got together, a Ford Foundation fellow and a number of Indian professors at the Indian Institute of Management in Calcutta, and they designed a marketing plan for what turned out to be the first social marketing program for contraceptives in India, and it was that model that Tim Black and I subsequently developed into the basic design of our family planning programs overseas.
Well, let's pick that thread up after we start the other thread, which was your return to graduate school and the founding of the company Adam and Eve. Tell us about that.
Well, that was at the outset part and parcel of the same thing. At the University of North Carolina, where I was studying to get a master's degree in family planning administration, I met a chap named Tim Black who was there for exactly the same purpose. And we hit it off right away and decided that what we wanted to do was to pursue the promotion of family planning and the delivery of family planning goods and services through non-medical outlets. At that time, most of the family planning in the world was done through clinics and doctors. And Tim especially recognized, as did I, that there weren't enough clinics and doctors and hospitals in the world to take care of sick people, let alone perfectly well people who wanted to plan and space their children. So just as part of our degree work at UNC, we decided to test mail-order condoms, which in the United States, like everywhere else, were not a prescription item. Condoms have been very common. But there happened to be a century-old law in the United States making it illegal to use the U.S. mails for the distribution of any kind of contraceptive or any information about contraceptives.
These were the Comstock laws.
These were the Comstock laws, 1872. And we therefore went into this with some trepidation, but Tim, in spite of having a couple of young children and a wife, said, what the hell, if we get thrown in jail for selling condoms to people who want them when we have such a high teenage pregnancy problem in this country, so be it. And we went ahead. And because of that law, nobody else was selling condoms by mail, and there was a pretty good market, and the orders rolled in. And we began thinking that this might turn out to be a source of revenue for the work that we hope to do in developing countries overseas. So we reincorporated into a separate company that became Adam and Eve and began selling condoms by mail fairly aggressively and built the Adam and Eve business from that basis. And while I was doing that, Tim was off in Kenya starting our first social marketing program promoting condoms, as it happened in Kenya.
So what really started out as an act of civil disobedience turned into a pretty big business.
Yes, and what we thought was a kind of dream, which was to actually generate profits selling contraceptives, and as it turned out, a whole line of sexually related goods in the United States would help us to subsidize programs overseas, and that, in fact, has taken place, and that is something I am still able to do and very much enjoy doing.
So as your company grew, you ran into some pretty big troubles, both with the state of New York and the federal government. Tell us about that.
The state of New York was a separate case, and that was a case brought by what was then PSI, then one of the nonprofit organizations that Tim and I founded, and that was a lawsuit because the state of New York had a number of laws that prevented the sale of condoms by anyone other than pharmacists, prevented the sale of condoms to anyone under the age of 16, prevented advertising of contraceptives, and so on. And that case went right up to the Supreme Court. It always takes a few years for that to happen, and we won there, and New York's law that inhibited all these things was, at that point, null and void. That was a separate and independent action. Our legal problems in Adam and Eve were related to the explicit nature of the videos that we were selling. The business really took off with the development of the video cassette recorder, and we sold a lot of those cassettes, if you can remember what those were. And there was a movement abroad in the Justice Department at that time to stamp out sexually oriented materials, particularly for companies that operated interstate, which of course we did. We had sales in virtually every state in the country. And
you were actually raided by armed law enforcement agents, which rounded up your employees and questioned them pretty aggressively.
Yes, it was a 7-year process, actually, but it began with that raid, 30 or 40 inspectors, assistant attorneys general, and so on. They were from North Carolina and from Utah in that first round, and also from the nearby county in North Carolina. And that was the first action that we faced and were taken to trial for disseminating obscenity in that county. And that was fairly early in the game, as it turned out. But in any event, we went to trial. The jury, from a rather conservative jury pool in a conservative North Carolina county, had to spend 5 hours watching sex films, which, as you can imagine, attracted a good deal of local attention.
Sure.
But they found us not guilty, basically concluding, in line with our lawyers' arguments, that the government was just trying too hard to tell us what we could watch and what we could view and what we could see. So having won that, we then had to battle with federal authorities, still in North Carolina and in Utah, and as it turned out later in Alabama. And that process went on for a good many years. We brought a lawsuit suing the government, the federal government, as part of that process and as part of our defense And we eventually prevailed. The key issue at the time was whether the government could simultaneously prosecute mail-order sellers of erotic material in several different venues.
Mm.
And they were doing that, threatening to do it with us and doing it more actively with some other mail-order sellers, and basically putting these guys out of business.
Yep.
I mean, they said, we're going to sue you in Alabama, we're going to sue you in Utah, we're going to sue you in Pennsylvania, and you're going to go broke, so you might as well make a deal with us now.
But you prevailed.
And quite a few mail-order companies did go out of business. We prevailed because several judges, one in New York and one in Utah, concluded as part of this lawsuit process that the federal government was violating the First Amendment to the Constitution by its multiple simultaneous prosecution strategy, and that this material was presumptively protected under the First Amendment until it was found to be obscene, which it in fact seldom was, either by a jury or by a judge, and that presumptively protected material, as the lawyers term it, could not be subjected to this kind of bombardment of simultaneous prosecutions. And the result was that policy was scrapped. The government settled with us. We paid a fine for a trivial violation as part of the deal, but that strategy was eliminated permanently, at least until now, from the DOJ armamentarium, and they haven't used it since.
So, Phil, you used the profits from your mail-order business to fund something called social marketing for contraceptives in developing countries. Explain how that works.
Well, the idea is to take advantage of the pre-existing network of the commercial world. In every country in the world, then and now, there are tens of thousands, or in larger countries, hundreds of thousands of shops and bodegas and tea stalls. And the idea of social marketing of contraceptives is to get attractively packaged, low-priced contraceptives available in all of those outlets, just as you can find Coca-Cola and
aspirin, whatever,
and beer, particularly in Africa. There's excellent distribution, cooking oils, and so on. And the design, the idea, is not terribly complicated, but it was new and controversial at the time because you can take advantage of existing shopkeeper networks and distribution networks, wholesaling networks, and so on. There's not a lot of training required, as there had been and still is for many kinds of family planning service programs. And you can follow the rules of commerce, that is, buying a product, packaging it attractively, setting a price that everybody can afford, signing a deal with a national distributor, and then backing it with a whole campaign of mass media advertising and other kinds of advertising, everything from T-shirts and ballpoint pens to the sponsorship of athletic events. I mean, all the kinds of advertising that we see here all the time. And it has worked remarkably well.
But you back this up by subsidizing the wholesale cost of goods with profits from your other company.
Not necessarily. I mean, the early programs that were supported in PSI and subsequently now DKT International for the last 20 years were assisted, subsidized by, funded by the U.S. government, in some cases by private foundations. What the profits from Adam and Eve have made possible is that we can start programs on a small scale, get them going in a new country, and then go to donors and say, we've got this thing started, it looks pretty good, it seems to be working pretty well, and we need your help to take it to scale. And that has been a very effective way of multiplying these programs.
So if you look at PSI and DKT, how many countries are you in today?
Well, the two together, probably 50 or 55. I mean, most of the world's population is covered by these programs, with the exception of China, I would say, because the delivery of birth control in China is unique and very effective, in spite of the fact that it has sometimes been coercive. I think it is not right now, but the rest of the world is pretty well covered. There were 70 programs the last time I added them up, reaching about that many couples. That is, 70 million couples are today being served by this social marketing mechanism, which represents a very substantial portion of the birth control that is used in the developing world.
And if you look at the statistics, the population statistics, most of those scary Malthusian projections seem to have moderated quite a bit because people are bringing the numbers down.
Well, birth rates are certainly falling, and we love to take credit for that, but of course there are many, many reasons why birth rates have been falling around the world. Mm-hmm. But the biggest reason why the Malthusians turned out to be wrong is that exponential growth in food production turned out to be a lot more possible than it was thought a century ago.
The Green Revolution.
The Green Revolution and others, so that there's more food grown today on a smaller amount of land than there was 20 or 30 years ago, and the technology is improving all the time, so that today 7 billion people are eating better than 5 billion people were eating 50 years or 40 years ago.
And one of the biggest challenges in developed countries like Italy and Japan is perhaps not enough population growth.
Well, they certainly feel that way, and you can see why. I mean, the first crisis that comes up with an aging population when people are having very few babies is the ratio of productive workers to retirees, and there's a lot of discussion of that here as well. The pyramid, the population pyramid, when there are very few young people in the workforce, or relatively few, means that there's a huge demand on those workers to keep retirees reasonably comfortable. So that's
a challenge.
That is a near-term crisis, and we don't know how it's going to turn out as populations level off and shrink, which they're certainly doing in most of Europe and in Japan, as you point out.
Coming back to marketing of contraceptives, you've been quite creative in that area, and one of the things I think that's quite noticeable is, we live in a sex-saturated culture where sex is used to sell, almost everything: cars, perfume, beer, you name it, everything except contraceptives. Why is that?
Well, there are two reasons, and we've experimented with this substantially around the world. Contraception remains today less controversial in countries like India than it is in the United States. The most telling example of that, and of the sex and contraception combination, came a number of years ago, probably 25 years ago now, when I submitted an ad to the New York Times when the HIV/AIDS crisis was at its peak, promoting condoms by mail, and mentioned in the body of the ad that condoms could be an effective contraception, a contraceptive as well, if properly used, blah, blah, blah. The New York Times said, "We'll let you run this ad if you remove all mention of contraceptive effect."
The Times said that?
Yes. And this was shortly after the Times had run a couple of editorials on the serious problem of teenage pregnancy. So we ran the ad. We could mention HIV and for your health, the prevention of sexually transmitted infections, but we couldn't mention contraception. In India, it would be just the other way around. If you led with contraception,
isn't that funny?
It would be acceptable in almost any medium. But if there was too much about sex, it might not be. So you're perfectly right. Sex is used to advertise a whole variety of products, and we use it to market and promote condoms in many, many countries, and that has sometimes been controversial.
Well, how successful have your efforts been in parts of the world where women are treated like property and are forced to cover their bodies and faces in public?
Well, we don't have any programs in most of the Middle Eastern countries, although there are a couple of programs in Jordan and I think one or two others. But there are programs in Afghanistan. We don't have one, but they're perfectly comfortable with the promotion of birth control there. Very comfortable with it in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Indonesia. The Indonesians are quite pro-birth control. So, generally speaking, we've had very few obstacles either from Roman Catholicism or from Islam. The only controversies really that have cropped up with us were in the Philippines, where the Catholic Church still has a very strong influence on public policy. But even there, our advertising is pretty aggressive.
The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation challenged you and others to develop a next-generation condom that preserves or enhances pleasure. What came out of that?
Well, that process at Gates isn't finished yet, and I'm sure they're still examining various designs and possibilities. But we have promoted in many, many countries all of the available options, which include a mild anesthetic for prolonging intercourse for people with premature ejaculation, lubricants that warm the sex organs, lubricants that cool the sex organs, larger sizes, ribbing, bumps on the surface of the condom designed to enhance sexual pleasure. All of those variations, including a lot of flavors and aromas. Strawberry remains the favorite in most countries in that category. We take full advantage of and have helped develop and promulgate. But it is very, very hard to design a product that permits the passage of sexual sensations, but does not permit the passage of any form of pathogen or sperm.
So, Phil, you've had quite an extraordinary career. You really can consider yourself an elder statesman now in 2 industries. What do you see for the human race ahead?
Well, I think it's going to get progressively better off. One of the remarkable things about my lifetime, starting with the fact that my life expectancy when I was born was about 65 or 66, I've managed to outlive that by a decade or more. And at the same time that's been happening here, actually somewhat more recently, the rest of the world, through, frankly, private enterprise, has gotten wealthier and wealthier, and even the poorest countries now are showing significant signs of economic growth, and economic growth and additional funds available in people's pockets solves all kinds of problems, from food to health care to education, and I see no reason to think that trend is not going to continue. There are a lot of flaws and problems along the way. The nature of work is changing, as you know. The automation of many jobs here in the United States is showing painful symptoms for the U.S. middle class. But overall, worldwide, people are going to get richer, they're going to get healthier, they're going to live longer, and I see no reason to expect that we're going to have any shortage of food, because that technology is improving all the time.
Well, Phil, it's been a delight having you on the show, sharing your stories and thoughts. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thanks.
That was Phil Harvey from DKT International here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by realclearradio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Next stop, a visit to San Francisco, where we join Peter Ackworth at the headquarters of Kink.com in the landmark San Francisco Armory. Stay tuned.